Right, a quick reminder of where this chapter fits into Leviticus. Chapters 1 to 7 set out the regulations for the offerings, the sacrifices, and chapters 8 to 10, which is where we are, take us through the inauguration of Aaron and his sons as priests. And chapter 8 gave us the ritual for the ordination with its cleansing, its clothing, anointing, atoning, and consecration. And that whole procedure, if you remember, lasted 7 days. And then last time we were looking at this, chapter 9 took us through day 8, when the priests began their official ministry by preparing for God to come among them in all his glory. They made sacrifices for themselves and the people. Aaron blessed the people, and then the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed the sacrifices. And all the people shouted for joy and fell down in worship. The Holy God was among them. His presence was with them. What a privilege, what a source of wonder and reassurance. Their Creator and Redeemer was intent on blessing them. If only they'd respond in obedience. So what comes next in the chapter we're looking at today is clearly extremely shocking. What was meant to be a joyful celebration was suddenly turned into a deeply felt tragedy. A holy wrath of God, which all the people knew was so dangerous to them, so dangerous that the elaborate animal rituals and offerings were essential to turn away God's wrath from because of their sin. That wrath, in fact, burst out of God's glorious presence and killed two of the holy, anointed, and sanctified priests. So, what was going on? And what can we learn from this chapter about God and about ourselves in relation to Him? Well, firstly, looking at verses 1 to 3, if God gives us much, much is expected. Aaron, as high priest, had 4 sons, and all 4 had been ordained as priests alongside him. They'd spent the previous week before the altar in front of the tabernacle, making atonement for their sin and preparing for the privilege of service in his presence within the holy place, the tabernacle. And now 2 of his sons, Nadab and Abihu, are struck down dead. On the same day that the Lord showed his approval and pleasure when fire came out from his presence and consumed the offerings on the altar, that same fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them. What had happened to bring about this severe punishment, the Lord's disapproval and displeasure? Well, verse 1 tells us this. They each took their censer, put fire in it, laid incense on it, and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, contrary to his command. The emphasis repeatedly in the previous chapter had been on following the Lord's commands. That's what they had done. And all the sacrifices, all the offerings followed the procedure that the Lord had commanded. But at this point, they did what was contrary to God's command. What exactly was done wrong is not really explained. It's led to some speculation. In verse 10, Aaron is told that the priest should distinguish between holy and the common, between the clean and the unclean. So was it the use of their own censer that was the problem? Should it have been a sacred censer? Or can we assume that their own censer might well have been sacred? Was it the wrong fire? Charcoal from the wrong altar or from the wrong source? The common, not the holy? Was the incense the wrong sort? Unauthorized incense is explicitly forbidden in Exodus 30, verse 9. But if so, why not say that explicitly in that verse? Some have suggested that the use of the censer and the incense was reserved only for the high priest, based on its use on the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16. Or was it more about where they were heading with the incense? Was their intention to enter the tabernacle, the cloud of God's glory, with the incense to in some way protect them? If so, that had not been authorized. And finally, what are we to infer from verse 8, where it might imply that they were influenced by drink? Well, all we can say is that whatever they did wrong was not commanded by the Lord. Whether it was the manner, the timing, or the place, they flagrantly disobeyed God. In offering unauthorized fire, they put themselves and all the people in jeopardy, and they paid the price. Verse 3 goes some way in helping us to see the essence of what they did wrong. Moses says to Aaron, "This is what the Lord had spoken of. This is what he warned us. Among those who approach me, I will be proved holy. In the sight of all the people, I will be honored or glorified." By all who approach him, God must be regarded as holy. He must be glorified. And the obvious implication is that Nadab and Abihu did not come before the Lord in such a way, and they suffered the consequences. They didn't regard God with due reverence, which results in obedience, and they seem to have little regard for their own sin in relation to God's holiness. Perhaps they somehow thought that all the sacrifices that had taken place meant that they could act with impunity, with an arrogance that thought that they knew best. And nor did they seek God's glory, but the implication is that they sought their own. This despite them being chosen, anointed, and sanctified to the task of priest. God's holiness, remember, is both beautiful and fearful. It is intrinsic to him. What do the seraphim say in Isaiah's vision in Isaiah 6? Holy, holy, holy. It's the only attribute of God that gets this threefold repetition for emphasis. God is not just holy, he's holy, holy, holy. We, on the other hand, are not holy. We're not like God. And when we sometimes think that we are somehow like him, we fall so short in our understanding of ourselves. There's a verse in the Psalms which has recently struck me, Psalm 50 and verse 21, which accuses the wicked of thinking that they are exactly like God. God says, "You thought I was exactly like you." But we are not exactly like God, not least because he is holy, holy, holy. And we're sinners and only made holy by God's mercy and grace. And of course, God does not change from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Jesus' prayer, that is to be our pattern prayer, begins with, "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name." Holy, holy, holy is your name. And in Revelation 4, the four living creatures in heaven proclaim the holiness of God. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. We come before the presence of a holy God, and it's only because of his mercy through the work of our great high priest, Jesus Christ, that we are not consumed. But there is something else going on here. We might ask, why so severe a punishment? A severe punishment for sin happened at the beginning of this new era, before disobedience could set in. God punished sin as a warning to all, not least the remaining priests. A warning that God, he himself, had to be treated as holy, that he had to be honored. And that's one of the functions of punishment, to act as a warning. Some of the commentators suggest that this severe punishment by God is a bit much for our sensitive modern sensibilities. That these verses, if you like, need to come with some kind of trigger warning. But I'm not so sure about people's sensibilities on this count. When it comes to punishment, many people want the severest sentences. For instance, over half the population in surveys say they want the death penalty back. I was listening to a phone-in recently about the sentence imposed on the woman who tweeted during the riots last summer inciting people to burn down asylum hotels. She got 3 years and a case was up for appeal, which she lost. And so many in the phone-in didn't want to show mercy. Indeed, they wanted the sentence increased. Many people do think that severe wrong deserves severe punishment. And a similar severe punishment happened at the beginning of the church, as recorded in Acts. Remember Ananias and Sapphira, who were also struck down at the beginning of a new era. They too made an offering to God, but their motivations were distorted and far from holy. And their deaths were a disconcerting reminder to the people inside and outside the church that God must be treated as holy. Was God too harsh with Nadab and Abihu, or with Ananias and Sapphira? Dare we even ask such a question? The example had to be made, and in doing so, it acted as a stark and shocking warning, potentially reducing future judgment and suffering. And look at Aaron's reaction. Aaron remained silent. Aaron had just seen two of his sons slain by God. He must have been shaken to the core. He was stunned into silence. No words could express his anguish, but his lack of protest also implies that he knew that God had every right to punish his sons in this way. And if Aaron didn't protest, then neither should we. There's one more point to make in explaining the severity of this punishment. The anointed, sanctified priests who were to enter the holy place had to be held to the highest standard. Those who were to serve in the tabernacle had to be obedient to God's commands. And that principle, that the more responsibility a person has before God, the stricter they may be judged, is carried over into the New Testament. Jesus said in Luke 12:48, everyone to whom much is given, of him much will be required. And Peter in 1 Peter 4:17, judgment begins with the household of God. Finally, James 3:1, we who teach shall be judged with greater strictness. The story of Nadab and Abihu vividly illustrates those New Testament sayings. As Christians, we're all influencing each other in the way we behave, in the way we talk, but church leaders have a particular responsibility to set a good example which others can follow. And that's why leaders and teachers will be judged with greater strictness. To those who are given much, much is expected. We need to pray for pastors, for teachers, for leaders, that they be kept from evil and strive for holiness. But moving on to verses 4 to 11, when God calls us to follow him, we must put the kingdom first. Look what happens next. First, Moses directs Nadab and Abihu's cousins, who are not priests, to remove the bodies and take them outside the camp, presumably for burial. In other words, the remaining priests were not to touch the bodies because this would have made them unclean. Then Moses tells Aaron and his two remaining sons that they are not to let their hair become unkempt or rip their clothes, both mourning customs of the time, still practiced by the Jews. And the rest of their relatives and the whole community, they could mourn, but not the priests. The priests were not to leave the entrance to the tabernacle, or they'd suffer death themselves. So what was going on? Some have suggested that the surviving priests had to identify themselves entirely with God's judgment and not arouse suspicion that they condoned their brother's sin. Mourning for them might make people think they had sympathy with their actions. Well, that might be true, and we read in Leviticus 21 that in normal circumstances, priests were allowed to mourn their close relatives, although the high priest was never to mourn, not even for his mother or father, or to leave the sanctuary area. If he did, he'd become unclean, especially if he touched the dead body, and that he'd then be unable to fulfill his duties. So I think in these particular circumstances, the three remaining priests, and that's all that was left, had to serve God exclusively and not abandon their crucial duties. In this case, as we'll see in a minute, the offerings were not yet complete, and the atonement was therefore not yet complete either. Their atonement and that of the people relied upon them remaining clean and holy. So total dedication to God's service was required by the priests. And we might be tempted to think that this dedication was just for then, that it doesn't really apply, as it were, to Christians today. But doesn't this remind you of the incident where Jesus challenges a man to follow him? Luke 9:59 to 60. The man replies, "First let me go and bury my father." And Jesus says, "Let the dead bury their own dead, but you go and proclaim the kingdom of God." The point Jesus was making is that following him will be costly. Sometimes God's kingdom will come even before family ties. Sacrificial service for the kingdom might demand it. So when God calls us to follow him, we must put the kingdom first. And maybe verses 8 to 11 are a practical outworking of that principle. The Lord speaks directly to Aaron, not via Moses, as he usually does. And this direct word to Aaron must have been reassuring because it signified approval. It's perfectly possible for the father to be right with the Lord, even when some of his children are not. And God prohibits priests from drinking alcohol whilst serving at the tabernacle. This is so they can focus on two things: clearly distinguishing between the holy and the common, the clean and the unclean, something that Nadab and Abihu seem to have got wrong, and so that they can teach the Israelites. Clear head, clear mind, essential for following the rules of what's holy and clean and common and unclean. And certainly your mind can't be befuddled by drink if you're going to teach. I read recently of a primary school teacher who was struck off for arriving at school in the morning with her breath smelling of alcohol. Not just disciplined, but struck out of the teaching profession. So the New Testament, whilst not prohibiting alcohol, unlike, say, Islam, is clear that drunkenness is wrong. Ephesians 5:18, Romans 13:13. And those who are teachers and elders should certainly not be given to drunkenness, 1 Timothy 3:3, or to much wine, 1 Timothy 3:8. And the reasons are similar. Spiritual discernment is impaired. Inhibitions may be lost, and certainly teaching would be impossible. Restricting the use of alcohol is part of putting God's kingdom first. Those who choose to drink alcohol must therefore do so in a restrained, moderate way, with care about when they do so. So we move into the final section of the chapter, which is still about the aftermath of Nadab and Abihu's disobedience. Verses 12 to 20. God's grace abounds if we fear him. Now, these verses are concerned with completing the offering process by eating the offerings that are specifically for the priests. First, we're told that there's the grain offering that has not yet been consumed. And then there are the fellowship offerings, which you might remember, a portion of which was reserved for the priest and his family. God had given these offerings for the priests to eat, and it was important that they obeyed this command to complete the whole process of atonement. But then Moses inquires about the goat of the sin offering, which has been mentioned back in chapter 9, verse 3, which was for the whole community. The parts of the sin offering for the priest, not burnt on the altar, were taken outside the camp to a clean place, and they were burnt there. We're told about that in chapter 4, verse 12. In other words, the priest could not eat meat for his own sin. However, the meat of the sin offering of someone other than the priest was to be eaten by the priest in a holy place. Chapter 6 and verses 24 to 30 set out those regulations. And Moses discovers that the meat for the people's sin offering had not been eaten, but had been burnt, presumably outside the camp by Eleazar and Ithamar, perhaps alongside the bull for the priest's sin offering. And Moses is angry that the Lord's instructions had not been followed. So is this another mistake on a par with what their brothers had done? Should these two brothers also suffer the wrath of God? Moses underlines how serious this is by explaining that the meat is most holy, that it should have been eaten as part of the ritual to take away, to bear the guilt of the community, to make atonement before the Lord. In not doing so, they put the whole Israelite community at risk of God's wrath. So surely we might expect the brothers and Aaron, their father, to suffer God's wrath for this disobedience. Well, then Aaron takes responsibility for his son's actions. Verse 19, today they, that's his sons, sacrifice the people's sin offering and their burnt offering before the Lord. But such things as this have happened to me. He's talking about the punishment of his sons by God. So in view of what happened to him today, if he'd eaten the sin offering, would the Lord have approved? Would the Lord have been pleased? When Moses heard this, we're told that he was satisfied with this answer. So what was the difference between the actions of Aaron's two sons? They both disobeyed God's law, yet two sons were struck down and two sons were graciously forgiven. It must be that Aaron had acted in good faith, sincerely, and not in rebellion, believing that it was inappropriate for him to eat the sin offering on this occasion, given what had happened to his sons. It's not necessarily due to his grief and sadness, though no doubt that was part of it, but because the displeasure evidenced by the Lord inclined him to think that he was not in a position to eat it. Perhaps he felt that he was not sufficiently holy, the sin of his sons in some way having contaminated him. Whatever the precise reason, the motivation of Aaron for not eating the holy meat, Moses sympathized with, and with his deeply afflicted brother, and he said no more. So I think we're to imply that on this occasion, God is gracious to Aaron, even though he may have been mistaken in not eating the meat because he feared God. So God's grace abounds if we fear him. So let's sum up. The events of this chapter stand as a stark warning to all who are called to serve our holy God in his kingdom. God can bring about severe judgment on those who act willfully in disobedience. Nadab and Abihu were high-handed, careless, and impudent in entering God's presence, and this was not acceptable. At the same time, we see that God is merciful and gracious in accepting Aaron's reason for not carrying out the divine instructions. We're all undeserving sinners who rely on God's abundant grace. At the cross, God's wrath was poured on Jesus instead of us, so that we might receive God's mercy. And to those who fear him and seek to wholeheartedly follow him, he will show mercy and grace. And he's able to do so because our great high priest has gone before, entering the heavenly realms with his own blood, the blood which atones for all sin, making our salvation safe and secure. And the challenge of this passage is to return that grace with the wholehearted sacrificial service that God demands, putting God's kingdom first. After all, love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all.